It's a new year, and do you know what I want in 2025? I really want to go racing, specifically in this thing, which is why I have this. It is an all-new K20 build from an all-new engine builder, and this is an all-new recipe for the 244 GTK. And if there's one thing I promise that we're going to accomplish in 2025, it's that we're going to go racing. So let's get this engine ready and drop it into the Ferrari. Now, I know for a majority of you, a recap is completely unnecessary. However, there are 130,000 new subscribers to this channel since the last time I posted a video about this project, so if you're new here, here's a quick rundown. The F40 is not the only Ferrari project we have on this channel. We also have this 1981 308 GTBI, which we've converted into a time attack race car. There is nothing factory left on this machine, but most importantly, it's powered by a Honda K20. If you're wondering why, it's to have a lightweight, high-powered, cost-effective engine swap solution that is still transverse in layout. But unfortunately, this massive project has been plagued with growing pains. Specifically, we've been losing engines. We blew our first 2.4-liter motor up at GTA Finals back in November of 23 by sending a rod right through the block. It was only our second ever event, so it felt premature, but that is racing. Unfortunately, the car sat for 6 whole months as we waited for a custom replacement engine, but once we got it, we hit another massive roadblock. We put the car on the dyno for the first time, and during our first ever initial warm-up session, the engine broke a rocker and sent needle bearings and metal shavings throughout the engine. This necessitated yet another complete teardown and rebuild of everything, and so we overnighted a third engine to put into this car. We put this one in right before Grid Life Laguna Seca at the end of last year. We absolutely thrashed to get this car done in time for Grid Life, and while it was running, we came up a little bit short. If you missed this episode, it's worth going back to watch because there's a lot of important information in it that brings us up to speed. And that brings us back to this engine. And this is the same one that you saw in the last 308 episode that we picked up from LAX. Clearly, it's back out of the car. Why is it wrapped up? Only to protect it while we've been cutting metal and making all sorts of metal dust in the shop as we get started on the F40. Today, we got to get this thing opened back up. We got to pull every accessory off of this engine and get it installed in the new one so we can put it back in the car. Now, as I get this engine opened up, I know that there are some burning questions in the comments, the biggest one probably being, did engine number 3 fail? Not quite. This engine still works at the moment, but it hasn't been without its hiccups. At this point, I want to take racing in the 244 GTK very seriously, and if I want to do that, I think that it's time I find a new engine builder. If I want to compete in 2025, and especially if I want to do more than one event a year, I need not only a reliable engine, but an engine builder that isn't halfway across the country and doesn't have 6-month lead times to get a replacement engine. I need somebody that's in my corner and is eager to see this car succeed in every way. I need someone that's local and has experience in these engines, and that's why I've turned to Dave at RS Machine. Not only does he come highly recommended by the local Honda community, a lot of my friends have personal experience with him and his engines. This is not a move to slight any other engine builders or companies in this industry. That's not my goal here, and that's never been the MO of my channel. But a lot of you guys have been suggesting for months, if not years, that it's time for a change, and I am there with you. With the change in engine builder also comes a change in approach. I'm no longer aiming for 1,000 wheel horsepower, and instead want a reliable 500 that will get us to the finish line each and every time. I want to build the car, drive it, and refine it, and then later down the line we can revisit the approach of mind-melting power. So with the old engine completely disassembled and thanks to a little bit of editing magic, I've got the new engine here on the stand ready to go together. But before we dive right into it, I want to tell you a little bit about this engine and how this formula is radically different from our old K20. This is a very different approach trying to accomplish a very different goal. And then on top of that, as it all comes together, We've never actually documented the entire engine build process on this channel. The last time you guys saw the engine go together was several years ago, and there's probably 200,000 of you guys that are new to this thing. So we're gonna talk about every part and piece as it goes on so that all of my K-Series fans out there know the exact formula of the engine that's in this car. And this is our 2-liter K20 built by RS Machine. As mentioned, RS Machine has built motors for a lot of friends of mine. Amir Benetou and Will Dries, whom have both been on this channel numerous times. Both have race cars with RS Machine engines in them. When both of them independently told me I had to go talk to Dave, well, I knew I had met the right guy. After a handful of meetings, Dave was asking all of the right questions in order to custom build an engine catered specifically to this project and our goals. As mentioned, we're shifting gears while we're at it. No longer are we aiming for earth-turning horsepower. Instead, I want something that is bulletproof and reliable. Doesn't mean we're not going to break some engines as we go through a learning process of developing this car and making it a real competition weapon, but this thing is going to stay together a lot better than what we've had in the past because it's a radically different formula. For starters, the cylinder head is a K20 head this time instead of a K24. The head has been worked with upgraded SuperTech valves, retainers, springs, and Type R RSX cams, but otherwise, the head is largely stock. We're not going with some fancy CNC'd monster flowing head, we're just going to compensate with a bit of additional boost. It's the bottom end that's received a majority of the work. It's sleeved, it's got upgraded rods, pistons, hardware. Basically everything's been upgraded to suit the task at hand. At least, that's the digestible version. We could go into more details, but I'll spare you. At this point, all that's left is to make a few small, subtle changes to get this thing ready for our application.
Promise.
Now, if you've watched all 100 and some odd episodes of this project, you probably already know all of the parts and pieces that comprise our engine build, but it's only been introduced piece by piece over a bunch of episodes, so I figured why not take the opportunity to go over all of the parts and pieces that we'll be equipping our engine with. If you want to know the formula, here it is. This is the 244 recipe. So I think the place to start on this whole thing is with the crank hub, which is an ATI super damper, along with a key. We've got some anti-seize on it. Hopefully this thing isn't going to fight me going on it. Probably will, because when does it not, really? Come on. After a bit of persuasion, the damper is on, and while it's the first piece we're installing, it will also be the last we touch. We're going to revisit this and torquing the crank nut once the engine is back in the car later in the episode. Up next is the water plate. I do not run a factory Honda water pump on this engine, primarily because I want to flow as much coolant as possible and because we're pushing a lot of coolant all the way to the front of the car and then back. I use an electric Mazir 55 gallon per minute water pump and it works really well. This track-tough conversion plate gets rid of the factory water pump and allows us to run this electric setup. The lower part of this fixture doubles as an alternator mount, and it's the only one available that will clear our dry sump pump. One of the changes I'm making on our 4th installation of this engine is a super low-profile -16 water fitting, because the previous one didn't give me enough adjustment range on the alternator belt itself. This fitting has a hose that will connect directly to the outlet of our water pump. Cool water will flow from the radiator through the engine block to the head and out the other side, which we'll touch upon later. This alternator mount is set up for use with an S2000 alternator. It's a very simple unit and readily available. We've got a turnbuckle adjuster for the top so we can adjust belt tension, and with that, it's done and we're on to our Wasp starter. As far as small accessories go, some of you may remember that our first 2 engines were non-VTEC. We were running a VTEC killer cam setup, which locked the cams into position and had no timing changes. But this time around, we are going to run both VTEC and VTC. My tuner, Andrew, has been begging for it this entire time, and it's going to make for a much more usable engine and power band. It's not going to have that insane rally car style idle anymore, but sometimes you gotta make some sacrifices, and this one seems worth it. Where the factory oil filter went, we're using another track tough piece, this time a relocation fitting. This is so we can plumb oil in from a remote oil filter housing into the engine, given we don't have an internal oil pump anymore. Up next, everybody's favorite piece, the PracWorks carbon fiber intake manifold. I had this one custom ordered with clear anodized parts as opposed to the standard red, and I went with a matte finish on the carbon, which I think looks incredible. This is one of my favorite pieces of the engine too, and it's also pretty affordable. We did have to custom build an adapter to run our Bosch 80mm drive-by-wire throttle body, but otherwise it's a bolt-on affair. The front of the engine gets our custom engine mount, and the other one will mount to the transmission once it's in the car. Now for what is probably the most important piece of the puzzle, our dry sump system. On this engine, I'm running a daily engineering dry sump pan and oil pump combo, and I've got to say it is a really neat system that has integrated channels within the oil pan and thus no external lines. It's also got an oil and air separator with 2 lines that come out to go back to our oil tank. After cutting some new O-rings so that everything will seal up properly, we got this bolted on, and from here we need to move on to the clutch, flywheel, and transmission. There are a lot of clutch and flywheel options for these engines, but I have stuck with Clutch Masters. I've used them on a lot of different projects, and they have their 725 series twin disc clutch setup, along with a lightweight flywheel that is a bolt-on solution for this engine. At 7¼ inches, it is a small clutch pack, and I don't know that I'd suggest it for a street car, but if you were determined, you could use it for such, although the clutch discs are unsprung, so it's not going to be street friendly. All of these parts get torqued to spec, and I'm careful about it because these are the last parts I want to come undone. But with everything torqued down, the transmission goes on. My choice of transmission for this project is a Quaife QK-E8J 5-speed sequential dog box. It's a direct bolt-on front-wheel drive replacement for any Honda application, but in our case we're simply using it in the back of a car. This one is cable actuated, although at some point I'm thinking about perhaps moving over to an air-shifted setup, in part for longevity for this gearbox and in part for the cool factor. Last but not least, before the engine goes in, is to change out our valve cover. Not only did I want one that looks better than this old factory unit, we need one that has a few different ports, mainly for venting and for vacuum regulation. For the hardware nerds out there, I've got the coolest hardware to bolt this thing down. Some custom forged aluminum nuts given to me by Tim at NG Motorsports, the same shop that built the head for our Audi project. He said I'd probably have a cool use for them at some point, and I figure this is it. Are they necessary? No, but as far as hardware goes, this is easily as cool as it gets. I thought about changing up the color for the valve cover, but I just couldn't turn away from red. It felt quintessentially Ferrari and Honda at the same time. For ignition, I'm using a Platinum Racing Products conversion kit that'll allow me to run GTR ignition coils. I was suggested by my tuner and multiple friends that these are the go-to coil unit, so this was an obvious choice. To wire them in, I've got a beautiful custom wiring harness from my friend Ryan over at Rywire. Ryan's been a pivotal part in getting this car up and running multiple times over, so another thanks to him for always taking care of this car and making sure any new additions are wired in successfully, the most recent being the changeover for our VTC and VTEC solenoids. I think the engine should be ready to go into the car. There's a number of accessories we'll add on once it's in place, but this is what gets dropped in. Surprisingly, the slightly bigger K24 was easier to fit into the car. The lower deck height of the K20 and the way that it rearranges some of the mount locations makes it a slightly tighter fit to get into place. Doing it solo isn't a ton of fun, but I've done it enough times at this point that I know it's just part of the game. The biggest change is the inability to lower it into place with the transmission mount bolted to the engine. It made grabbing the engine and holding it with the gantry a lot easier as well, so it's a bit of a conundrum. The transmission mount has to go into place after the engine is actually located where it needs to go, so a jack is used underneath it to bring it up into place and off of the frame rails. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward, and the entire process can be done in maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Seeing the engine back in the engine bay feels really good. I have a good feeling about this RS Machine engine and what we're going to accomplish in 2025. It's kind of frustrating to look back and realize the 244 GTK spent almost the entirety of 2024 sitting right here on this lift without an engine. We had one brief jaunt over to the Dyno and up to Laguna Seca, but I have huge plans for 2025 that should change that, including potentially traveling across the country to compete with this car. And now we're on the home stretch. We've got to hook up all of our peripherals and get everything into place. Having done this as many times as I have, thankfully I now know the order of operations in which to knock everything out. There's a lot of parts that fit within this engine bay, and once some of them are in place, it's impossible to get around them in order to install other parts and pieces. For example, everything under or even around the water-to-air intercooler needs to get finished before it goes into place. For the turbo peripherals, we're running a turbo manifold that I built at the beginning of our build series. It was my first ever TIG welding project. We're pairing that with a TurboSmart TS2 6262 turbocharger, a TurboSmart ProGate 50 wastegate, and TurboSmart blow-off valve. Up next, the axles. We're running custom axles built by Drive Shaft Shop, which utilize Honda inners and Corvette outers. Because if you're new to this build series and haven't seen the previous episodes, all of the suspension, from the control arms to the uprights, are completely custom. We threw all of the original Ferrari stuff out, and in its place built something custom that is better suited to the task at hand. The hubs, as you might guess, are from a C6 Corvette. Everything else we designed, built, and then rebuilt a handful of times right here on the channel. With the axles installed, we're actually able to hold the driveline still, and then I was able to torque the crank nut down to 200 foot-pounds of torque. Now this brings us to the last pieces that have to go on the car. We have what I believe they call the mandrel and the belt drive for our oil pump. I tried to knock the rest of this stuff out off of camera because we've done this install too many times to keep it interesting. Pardon the shortcut. At this point, we got to get this stuff on, and then I think we're going to be in a position to fire this thing up. Now, one thing that I don't currently have on the car is a complete cooling system. We're going to need a custom water neck from Rob over at Track Tough. He's currently working on that. We're going to have that probably here in another week or so. But that's not going to stop us from running it, at least for, 20, 30 seconds. We'll fire it up, make sure that everything seems happy. And with that, we can call this thing one huge step closer to being on track in 2025. With the mandrel and belt drive on, the list is complete. I had to fill it with oil, and then we were able to prime the oil pump and start checking fluid systems. For those unaware, this is another advantage of a dry sump system. We can spin the oil pump without the engine running, allowing us to fully pressurize the motor with oil and make sure that we have no leaks and no starvation issues. We just finished filling it with oil. I think we are squared away. I checked oil pressure. It looks really good. We primed the engine with the oil pump, no belt, everything checked out. We don't have any leaks. Hooked the fuel back up. turn the fuel pumps on. We don't have any leaks there. I think we are ready to go. Again, no cooling system, but we're just gonna fire it up, let it run for a second, and it should be happy. I hope. I think it should be fine. Hopefully fourth time is actually a charm. It's important to have a good battery in the car when you want it to run, and this one's a little low on juice. Second time's a charm, is it not?
That was super smooth.
Yeah, that was remarkably uneventful.
Like, actually smooth as f.
It does not sound super gnarly crazy, but it sounds very happy, and I think that's worth something. So, and it smells good. Nice, no leaks. Everything seems happy. I think we get this thing sorted as far as the coolant next. We can put coolant in it, and from there, tighten up some loose bolts, do a little bit of tinying, throw some zip ties at it, and we're ready to head over to the dyno, figure out what kind of power it makes, get it tuned, get it happy, and get out to the track. So we'll see you guys then.